Writers, have you ever wondered what an essay really is or how to write one that makes you think and cracks your heart open? Today, I'm joined by essayist, memoirist, and master of the personal critical form, Lilly Dancyger. We're diving into her latest book, First Love, an intimate, electric collection of essays about friendship, identity, and what it means to grow into yourself within the relationships that shape you. During our conversation, Lilly shares her fierce insights on the craft of memoir, why she resists the idea of writing as catharsis, and how she pushes back against the dead girl trope by keeping her murdered cousin Sabina vibrantly alive on the page. If you've ever asked yourself how to turn painful memories into powerful art, this episode is for you. Welcome to Writing Your Resilience, a podcast for writers who want to create stories that change lives, especially their own. I'm your host, Lisa Cooper Ellison. As a writer and trauma-informed writing coach, I'm here to guide you on a transformative journey through the art of writing, self-discovery, and resilience. Each week, I'll share my best tricks, tips, and strategies to help you write more authentically, craft deeper, truer stories, and overcome the common storytelling roadblocks we all face. Together, we'll explore how to bounce back when life gets tough and stay connected to your inner calling. So grab your pen, your notebook, and an open heart. It's time to do the work that changes the world, one story at a time. Hi, I'm Lisa Cooper Ellison, and I am excited to invite you to join me on March 5th for my course, Memoir Backstory. If you're a memoirist, you know that backstory is a crucial part of your memoir, but it can be so tricky to figure out how much to include and how to weave it in without overwhelming your story. In this webinar hosted by Jane Friedman, you'll discover what to keep, what to cut, and what to repurpose so that you can write a captivating story while also working on your author platform. Best of all, this webinar is only $25. To register, go to janefriedman.com/memoir backstory with Lisa Cooper Ellison or click on the link in the show notes. I look forward to seeing you on March 5th. Well, hello, Lilly. I am so honored to have you on the podcast today. Welcome.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, it has been such a joy to read your essay collection, First Love. I'm going to hold it up for the people who are seeing this on YouTube. It is such a well-written book. I adored just every sentence that you wrote, and there were so many things that spoke to me. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes, but I always like to give my guests the first chance to tell us a little about who you are, what you do, and what you would like us to know about First Love and any of your other writing, because you have an extensive publishing background and publishing history.
Sure. Thank you so much. Yeah, First Love is my newest book. It's an essay collection. I call them personal critical essays. There's some hybrid stuff going on. They are all about friendship, but they're also about what it means to be a woman in the world and the different kind of roles that we're expected to fill, allowed to fill, and kind of the process of evolving into a self, which in my experience, and I think a lot of people's experiences, is something that happens in community, which is why that story ended up being told through stories of my closest friendships. My first book was a memoir, Negative Space. It was also a hybrid, but in a different way. It's kind of an art book memoir about my father, who was an artist, who died when I was 12. And so it's the story of his life and art, and also the story of the decade I spent interviewing everybody I could find who knew him to try to put together a fuller picture. In addition to my own writing, I teach at 2 MFA programs at Columbia and Randolph College, and I run a bunch of independent writing classes, and I'm a freelance editor. And I think those are my main hats at the moment. Yeah.
And I can say that we have some shared clients, and anytime a client has worked with you, they always sing your praises.
Oh, thank you.
Because you bring such a sharp editorial eye to their pages, to all of the ways that you teach, and you definitely brought it to this book. And what spoke to me is there are so many ways that you comment on how friendships work that made me think about the roles friendships play in my own life. And then I think there are some points of intersection in our own personal experiences There was a time in my life when I was roaming the streets at 3 a.m. And understand both the terrifying nature and also the freedom of that. And then the music, there's definitely some intersections there. I grew up listening to a lot of metal, going to different metal and punk shows. So I loved seeing that intersection of experience, in addition to all of the ways that you don't just write so clearly about your experience, but that you infuse it with all of these other bigger themes or issues in cinema or tropes that people can fall into, so that we can think about this in a bigger way. And we're going to talk about some of the writing piece in a moment, but I want to start by talking about something that we discussed during our email exchange, which I think is so important for us to talk about. And that is the fact that you personally bristle at the idea of memoir being associated with catharsis. I'm going to say right off the bat, I agree with you 100%. We are on the same team here. And I read an essay that Jane Friedman recently wrote for her blog post about why your memoir may not sell. And that's one of the red flags she talks about. If your book, if you wrote it just to process your pain, then that's not enough. So that's her opinion. But I'm really interested in your opinion on this.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that for sure. I think processing your experience and healing yourself is a great reason to write, but that's a very different endeavor than writing something that you intend to publish and share with the world.
Yes.
And I think a big reason that I tend to bristle at conversations that situate memoir in like therapeutic language or talk about it as healing and cathartic and all of that is that I think it often is a way to kind of belittle or downplay the artistic value, especially with women's writing.
Yes.
If a man writes about his life, he's making art drawn from personal experience. If a woman writes about her life, she's trying to heal herself, and going through an emotional process. I tend to kind of take a defensive posture whenever that idea comes up, even though, I have drawn from the most difficult experiences in my life to write my books. And there definitely was an element of part of the reason that I come to the page to begin with is to make meaning of hard things, and is to kind of try to make experiences that don't make any sense make sense, right? And try to find something beautiful in them even, But that's only a part of it, and that's kind of like the entryway into it. But for most of the process, my motivation is much more focused on making art than it is on digging around in my own wounds, right? I go looking into my past for material, but then once I have that material, I'm more focused on making something out of it. I think I just tend to find that those conversations are often laced with condescension and misogyny. I get defensive about memoir in general, and especially women's memoir, and especially women's memoir about a traumatic experience as being art, on the level with anything else that we talk about as art making, and the kind of personal impact of it, and if it helps you make sense of your own experience, and maybe even sometimes helps you heal, although that has honestly not really been my experience, then that's a great additional benefit.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to separate the process of creating art and the process of telling a really great story with the process of healing. And, what I often tell people is that healing is about integration. It's about finding out how whatever you've gone through fits within the story of your life and how you operate. And that's an ongoing process.
Yeah.
And writing can definitely help you do that. But I've actually studied the research behind this, and some of the research that gets thrown around is James Pennebaker's research, which says that, if you write about difficult life events, it's going to improve your health. And yes, there is clinical data that can work if you make new meaning from it. If you do not make new meaning from it, if you just, what I say is polishing your pain, which I do see a lot of in the writing space, where someone has written something horrific and they think that if they're just write it better or clearer, or they make those details more precise or sharper, then it's going to elevate itself to art. But we're still at the realm of, this is what happened to me. And what happens is you can actually re-traumatize yourself in the process. And there's a lot of data around that, writing about traumatic events in particular can increase symptoms of PTSD. It can do all of these other things we want to be really mindful of so that we're not just trying to polish pain or thinking that healing is enough when it comes to publishing for a larger audience, because art is about meaning and it's about elevating it so that you are part of a conversation and that you're contributing to that.
Yeah, I agree. I agree entirely. And I also think even when you do make meaning out of an experience on the page, that doesn't mean you're all of a sudden healed.
Yes.
The work of processing your experience and being okay or getting to a place where you can move forward, that's an ongoing thing, and that's a big and extensive project in and of itself that doesn't just happen as a byproduct of writing a book about a difficult experience. Personally, I've actually found that sometimes writing about an experience and spending so much time crafting that experience into a narrative that arrives at some meaning at the end, right? It allows you to intellectualize and sometimes distance yourself from the experience.
Yes.
So I think most memoirists, I've been in therapy for a long time, and I've had that experience many times of I'm trying to talk about an experience but then I realize I'm narrating the book version, and then I'm talking about kind of this narrative that I've created for myself, and I have to take a step back and kind of reform that connection with the immediacy of an emotional experience.
Yeah.
So it's not as simple as like write a memoir about the hard thing that happened to you and then you'll be all better.
Yes. I love how you just said that, because I think people think about healing in terms of I will heal and I will be okay and it will be over. And that is definitely not the case for anyone. You may make meaning of it and you may be able to understand it in a way that provides that distance, but you can still be reactivated and have those same feelings and go through whatever it is again. You're going through it at a deeper level, and you want to allow for the spaces where you can do that so that your art can be a place where you're doing something different. And you, I would say, are a master of the essay. You do such a good job with it. And I am curious, your first book was a hybrid memoir, and obviously you've just talked about how it was hybrid in a different way. Why did you choose to write this, which includes so much personal information, as an essay collection versus, say, a more traditional memoir that had a straight narrative arc? Like, what did you hope to accomplish with this that you couldn't have done if you had written it in another way?
Oh, there are a couple of reasons for that. One was that I dove right into this project, started writing First Love before Negative Space was even out. So I was, rolling right from a memoir into a next thing. And part of it was just that like writerly distractibility or like the need for a new challenge. I didn't want to just do the same thing again that I had just done, even though, of course, it wouldn't have been exactly the same, but, I didn't want to just repeat the form. I wanted to try something else and find a new way in to a project. But also because the content itself, the subject matter of First Love, writing about friendships, a big part of kind of the central idea, like if there is a quote-unquote thesis to the book, is how complete the distinct universe of each intimate relationship is, including how distinct the version of ourselves that we get to be in that relationship is. So it made sense for the pieces in this book to be more, discrete units where each relationship is talked about in its own essay, and that essay is its own complete, distinct thing with its own kind of set of rules and its own sensibility and its own shape and approach and voice and style and all of that, So I think it just allowed more space for play and variation in thinking about essays rather than one continuous narrative.
Yeah, I love that you brought in play, and you said something that's really important, because people often ask me, okay, well, what will happen after I complete my memoir? Will I have arrived? Will I have some sort of feeling that I hope to have? Maybe you will, maybe you won't. But one thing that often happens, the thing that's next, is that if you are a writer, you're going to find another project, and you're going to want to do something different. You're going to set a new challenge for yourself. You're going to push your art in another direction and see what else you're capable of. And I see that all the time with the writers that I meet with and that I work with and I get to interview, because there is no mountaintop we land on. When we're artists, it's always about living with the discontent and finding out what that new challenge is so that we can use our voice or whatever the medium is in a different way. And one of the things that you do on the page is you're able to not just talk about intimacy and intimacy in friendships and friendships between women, you're able to really show it on the page. That's one of the things that I loved. I felt like I really knew your characters, and I could feel the love for your characters that you had rendered. And I felt like there was an intimacy between me and them. And I think one of the best ways for people to experience that is to hear your words, because you do it so well. Would you be willing to read something so that people can hear that? And then we can talk about how you created something that is so intimate. Like, what decisions did you make as a writer in order to elevate just an experience into art?
Sure. Yeah, I'd be happy to. And just, one more thing about that idea of like how there's no mountaintop. It's like, this is not a discouraging thing, like you'll never get there. This is a good thing, right? Like, thank God for that. How sad would that be to finish writing? To be like, okay, I've done it, check. Then what would you do?
The analogy that I would say is, what will happen if high school is the best time of your life?
Right. Yeah.
I find that to be somewhat tragic,
Absolutely.
No offense to anyone who had a great high school experience. That certainly was not mine.
Okay, so I'm going to read this paragraph that you pulled out earlier. I'll say before I read, this is a paragraph that is talking about intimacy, but it's also a paragraph that's talking about cocaine. So that's why the cadence is the way that it is. I can see us so clearly. Two pale girls dressed in black, skinny as street dogs, approaching a favorite stoop and both slowing down instinctively. Not even the briefest break in the torrent of stories we were volleying back and forth as we had a second, simultaneous conversation with only eyebrows or jutting chins, agreeing it was time for another smoke break. Smoothing the backs of our handmade mini skirts as we sat, perching on the very edge of the concrete step, knees touching or almost touching as we angled ourselves toward each other, still talking so quickly like we were on a phone line that was about to be cut. Taking our packs of Lucky Strikes out of the pockets of our leather jackets and tapping them against the heels of our hands exactly 3 times before each taking out a smoke and squeezing it between our lips, jittery with our jaws stimulant clenching, flinging curtains of curly hair out of our faces. A few rare seconds of silence as we both focused on controlling the jerking, vibrating motions of our mouths and hands for long enough to get the cigarettes lit before shoving our matching black mini Bic lighters back into our bras. I can see our bony knees bouncing up and down, fingers flicking ash off our cigarettes whenever we weren't taking drags, which we did perfectly in sync. Sucking our smokes down to the filter and flicking them into the street in parallel arcs before rising and continuing to pace the neighborhood, both aimless and hurried at once.
It's just lovely.
Thanks.
You talked for a minute about the cadence and how the cadence is related to the experience, which is about being on cocaine. And so, that's going to be something that's going to be edgy. It's going to be fast-paced. How did you create that? Because when I was listening to you, I felt that sense of edginess, that urgency, that hyped-up feeling. What did you do on the page to illustrate that?
Yeah, I love that you called out that paragraph, actually, because I rewrote that paragraph many times trying to get to that feeling. I think at one point it was one really long sentence, and I was like, okay, that's too much. That's like too hard to follow on the page. It's like trial and error of experimenting of how do I get this like kind of frenetic relentlessness of that feeling. Also like the syncopation, and it wasn't just fast, it was like fast and coordinated. This was a ritual that was repeated so many times, and I was also trying to get that across with that one paragraph of like, okay, I'm going to describe this once, one time of us sitting and smoking a cigarette, but I wanted it to be clear that this was like actually a description of hundreds of times that this happened, And so getting the kind of the specificity of like tapping the cigarette pack 3 times before taking one out. And even our cigarette inhales were in sync, and we would finish them at exactly the same time and then kind of look at each other and flick them at the same time. And there's a lot that I was trying to get across with that paragraph. The sensation of, that edgy kind of restlessness, and a frenetic feeling, but also that feeling of being so very in sync with another person. But as for how, I don't know. It was just rewriting it many, many times until it felt that way, and reading it aloud while revising.
Yeah, and some things I noticed is like the length of your sentences, how much you were packing into them, and then just even some of the words, like the jutted jaw, the tap, tap, tap of the cigarettes. There's this sonic component. Do you know Athena Dixon?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I love Athena.
Yeah, she's
great. And, she has a poet's sensibility, and she's always thinking about, what is the sonic component? What is it that the reader is going to hear, even if they're just hearing it in their minds? And how does that affect their experience of things? And I think that you definitely do that in this paragraph. And it has this sacred feel to it, like that sense of ritual that you mentioned. Because, we can tell just the fact that they are so in sync, and that it's the eye contact, it's the proximity of the knees that tells us it's time for another cigarette. And it's that whole process of writing and revising. And I don't know what your revision process is, but sometimes I have to actually walk around and even do whatever the action is out in the world, and almost recreate the scene physically in order to tap into the specific details that I need so that I can bring it to life on the page. I'm wondering if you do anything like that.
It's funny, I think when I do kind of experiential stuff like that, it's usually earlier in the process for me of like trying to access memory enough to get details on the page. And then by the time I have the scene written, I have my details and I'm revising, which, first I revise for like flow, and is the story following the trajectory I need it to follow? Am I taking too long or not long enough in certain parts and all of that? But then the later stages of revision are definitely for sound, as you mentioned. And at that point, it's just a lot of go over and over and over and over and over it. Print it and read it on paper and make notes and then input them and then leave it alone for a week, and then I'll like send it to my Kindle and read it there, like just trying to encounter it in different ways, change the spacing or the size of the font or whatever, just trying to trick my brain into seeing it as a new thing so that I'm really paying attention to each word rather than like skimming over it because I've read it 100 times already by then.
Yeah, I love that you have the strategies because we do get blind to our work. And something that I will do is I will record myself reading it and then listen back to it without the words in front of me. Then I will listen back to it with the words in front of me. And I notice that each time I have different experiences. And I was in a class once with Sharon Harrigan, and this was a good long while ago. But what we did is we traded pages and we had someone else read our work because they aren't going to interpret it in the same way. And it was fascinating to hear how another reader interprets your sentences. Oh my gosh, you see it and feel it in a different way.
That sounds exciting and terrifying. I would love to do that.
That's exactly how it felt.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a both and experience. So we've talked a little bit about this granular nature of editing and how you approach things like intimacy and how you do it on the sentence level. But one of the things that you also do really well is you zoom in and then you zoom back out. And you talk about these larger themes, you'll talk about movies, you'll talk about pieces of writing, you talk about other things so that it's not just this narrator's experience on the page.
Yeah.
We're dealing with ideas. And, a lot of agents right now and editors are enamored with Memoir Plus, which, if you don't know what that is, listener, we're talking about memoir as in your personal story of transformation in addition to something else. So that could be research, it could be connection to something happening out in the world, it could be a lot of different things. And if you have a really nice definition of Memoir Plus, please feel free to share it with us. But I'd love to know what you do in order to zoom in and zoom out, and where does that show up in your process?
Well, yeah, I guess I'll circle back. The third thing I was going to say to your earlier question about why this is an essay collection rather than a memoir is also that I didn't want to just talk about myself. I had just finished a memoir, I was feeling very exposed, and I was like, I don't want to just, open my veins onto the page. I want to talk about things that are interesting to me. I want to turn over questions about what it means to be in relation with other people, what it means to depend on other people and how we become who we are. And I wanted to talk about Sylvia Plath and Anais Nin and not just recounting more of my own experience. And that, to me, a lot of times it's that kind of external thread of bringing in, other writers or music or film or, I interviewed friends for some of these pieces. It's a lot of times that external stuff that keeps me interested. It's easy to kind of, I think, to get bored of your own story, right? Or to wonder, like, is this even interesting? And I know now, after like writing enough about my own life and talking to enough other writers who write about their own lives, that kind of feeling of like, oh, this isn't even interesting is not always true. A lot of times it's not true. It's just that, we have distorted views of our own value in the world. But even if it is false, if I start to feel disinterested in the thing I'm writing, I'm not going to keep writing it.
Right.
So I have to find a way to like keep my own kind of curiosity alive on the page. And a lot of times that comes from reading other things, and going to a museum and looking at art and listening to music that I loved at a certain time in my life and thinking about the feeling that evokes and how that connects to the thing I'm trying to talk about in the essay or, whatever it might be. I don't know, it just makes it feel more layered and rich. And I'm talking about like in the writing experience itself feels more layered and rich. But I think that is often also true for the reading experience, and readers like to feel like they're either learning something about something they're already interested in, or, a lot of times I consider that material as like an invitation, a connecting point for a reader, right?
Yes.
So like in the essay where I'm talking about Janis Joplin or where I'm talking about Heavenly Creatures, like that movie in particular, there's so many people, it's like kind of an under the radar movie. Not everybody knows about it, but the people who do know about it love it. Right? Mm-hmm. So that essay that I just read from opens with that film. And so a reader who might not have had the experience of being like a teenage punk cokehead with an obsessive relationship with her best friend in New York City might have the experience of watching and loving that film, so that's right. Another way for them to connect and a way for them to kind of feel like the essay is for them and speaking to them. And that, I think, has a lot to do with why agents and publishers are interested in that style, is that it theoretically at least broadens the audience, quote unquote.
Right. Yeah, so creating those intersection points for you as the writer so that the work continues to feel interesting, and then also broadening the audience by providing different intersection and connection points with your readers. There's two reasons why you might do that. And what I can say for myself, one piece that I found to be really compelling, and so I'm just going to offer a little confession. Sure. I've loved your work for a long time, and I remember when you were pitching this book, and we happened to be part of a group, and I was able to see your book proposal, which was fantastic, by the way. It was an amazingly written book proposal. In it, you were very fierce and very clear, and one of the things you talked about was the dead girl trope. And I immediately started thinking about, like, wow, what is that? How does that play out just in the world, right? And in how I'm engaging with different stories or different things happening in the world. And then, of course, there is this very personal piece for you that you lost your cousin to a murder, which is something that you start out with. And that shows up repeatedly in your book. And what you also talk about, and I don't want to give too much away about that part of the story because I want people to read your book.
I don't care.
I'm always, if I love a book, I want people to go buy it. One of the things that you do really well is you create this super intimate scene in the beginning that brings her to life. And then she shows up throughout, though we do know early on that she is tragically murdered. And that serves as this launching point for talking about this. And it creates this sense of tension, what are we going to learn about this? But you talk about this idea of the dead girl trope and how often these stories that become murder mysteries are about either, the murderer or the investigator, who's solving the crime, but it's never about the girl. The girl becomes the silent piece. And you don't allow that to happen. And that's an intentional thing you talk about in the book. So when you were thinking about organizing this essay collection and you were thinking about it just even as a project, how did you know that Sabina's death needed to be a part of this project? And how did you think about the role she was going to play in this book so that we don't learn early on, oh, by the way, she's gone, and then she's just kind of a piece of furniture, or, you know, she's part of the scenery, but she's not part of the story?
Yeah. She was part of the project from the very beginning. There were always kind of two entry points or two seeds of this project that grew together. There's the idea of close female friendships as like a site of identity formation and as like a central love story in our lives. And then there was the story of Sabina's death and the story of our relationship, right? And I knew from the beginning that I didn't want to write about her death, right? I've written about her, and her death is part of that story, but it's not the focal point. And that's why, with that first essay, the title essay in the book, First Love, is where we start. And we start with me and Sabina as young kids and show our relationship developing through our childhoods and teen years. And you don't find out until late in that essay that she dies. And that was very intentional because I wanted her to be a character alive on the page first, and I wanted readers to fall in love with her and to be invested in her as a person and to be invested in our relationship rather than kind of meeting her as a dead girl, like that trope, right? I mean, I love Law & Order, have seen every episode 500 times, but you meet the victim as a victim in every episode, right? And that's just like one example of that trope where it's like, it is a story about a murder, right? But a story about a murder starts with the murder, right? Or often starts when the person is already dead. So we never actually see them. It's about their absence and about the impact of their absence, but not about them. And so that was kind of a central challenge of this whole project, was how to do that differently and how to not fall into that trope, because it's, there are reasons that those stories are told in that way. It's very difficult to push against it. And in some ways, I don't think I fully did what I was trying to do in that way. The murder still is very much kind of at the forefront, and I do talk about her death and talk about my reaction to her death a lot. So yeah, I think if I had spent 5 more years to write the book, I might have really turned that trope all the way inside out. But I nudged it, at least. I pushed against it and kind of at least made it visible and made, I think, the pushing against the trope part of the story, which was kind of the best way that I could find to do that, was to just engage directly with, like, here is this kind of narrative trope that this story could very easily fall into, right, or map onto. Here's all the reasons I don't want to let it do that. And here's how I'm trying to not let it do that.
Well, one of the things that I think you do that does defy the trope is that, number one, you call it out. And in a later essay, you talk about the different writers that inspired you: Sarah Perry, Rose Anderson. And they're gorgeously written. In the case of Rose Anderson's book, it is the death of her sister. In the case of Sarah Perry's book, it is the death of her mother. And they bring those characters to life on the page in the same way that you do. But the fact that you call out, like, hey, there's a certain expectation you're going to have for the story, there is a certain way that this story is told, to me brought a different lens to it and made me take a more critical eye to both how Sabina was portrayed in your story, and you do keep her alive in the same ways that Rose and Sarah do, by having stories where she is present, she's there. And, yes, the murder is there in the first pages, but it's not really discussed again a whole lot, like, until later on. So she gets to live for a good long while. And when I talked with Sarah Perry, that was one of the things she said is, I didn't want to start this book with my mother being dead on the first page or in the first chapter, and then she's gone, and you don't get to hear from her again. So she was very meticulous in the research she did to both render their lives together, but also her mother's life before she was born.
Yeah.
And so I think you're doing similar work, but the fact that you call it out brings an additional power to it.
Thank you. That's part of where the personal critical essay idea comes in, right? And that's one thing that I love about the essay form is that I think in a lot of ways it's like uniquely positioned to consider itself while it's unfolding. You can talk about the story you're writing and how you're writing it in memoir also, but there's something about the essay form because it is so often like driven by a question, right? And driven by like an attempt to make sense of something. There's all this space available to talk about the story you're trying to tell and why it's difficult, and to kind of go back and try again and examine what you're doing and examine how you're maybe not succeeding. And I don't know, that's very appealing to me because that's often the solution I lean into if I find that a story is really difficult to tell for whatever reason. I end up talking on the page about why it's so difficult and kind of examining what the roadblocks are, and ideally making those roadblocks part of the story to actually make the story richer and more interesting rather than constrained.
And I would say you definitely succeed in that area.
Thank you.
You and I both work with stories all day long, other people's stories, our own stories. I often ask people this question in terms of how are you taking care of yourself? But I'm really curious, as a person who works with stories all day and needs to make space for your own story, how are you cleansing your palate or clearing your mind so that there is room for the writing you need to do, especially as we are navigating 2025?
Yeah, the news is definitely a bigger impediment to me. I occasionally feel overwhelmed by the amount of like other people's work that is inside my brain and like the amount of creative energy that I'm expending on other people's stories. But that only happens once in a while when I've taken on too much. I'm like, okay, I need a day off. Most of the time I feel like energized by it, actually.
Yeah.
The fact that I get to think about stories all the time helps my writing, and I've definitely become a better writer through, noticing and explaining things to students and editing clients, or like things that I notice that I always call out in other people's work that I can see so clearly, like, okay, this isn't working because XYZ, right? And then I'll see myself doing that same thing and be like, oh, okay, yeah, right. But I'll be able to see it clearly because I've seen it so many times before in other people's work. That said, I do have to be very intentional about like carving out time for just my own work, and my kind of like bare minimum for sanity is 1 day a week that's for my own writing. Ideally more than that, but if I can get one writing day a week, I can like survive without becoming harried and resentful and anxious and all the things that writers who are not writing become. So right now that's Fridays. My whole planner is color coded, but Fridays are like blocked out in pink so that I can't put anything else on there. If I try and schedule something on Friday, there's this immediate visual clue of like, nope, sorry, that whole day is blocked off. And I try to not even look at my email on writing days. I wake up and I have my coffee and I'm just in my bubble and I don't think about anything else. And knowing that I don't have to stop at a certain time to get back to other work or whatever gives me that spaciousness that I need so that the rest of the week I can go all in on like clients' manuscripts or students' pages or whatever and not feel like I'm taking from my own creative well because I know I have that time designated.
Yeah, it's so important to be able to fill our creative wells in whatever way works for you, but making sure you are carving out time to write and create, especially if that's the thing that makes you feel alive. I don't know about you, but whenever I have made the time to write, it doesn't matter what else I'm going to do. The rest of the day goes well because I made the time.
Yeah. And even like the rest of the week, I don't know, like I've had a busy week this week. When we finish this call, I have a bunch of student work to read, but I'm not stressed out about that because I know tomorrow I get to write.
Exactly. Well, if people want to connect with you, they want to learn what you're up to, and I know you have several things you've talked about on Instagram. We are recording this before you go to AWP, and this will probably air around the time that you're at AWP or maybe a little after. So people may or may not be able to catch those things, but I know that you are a person who's always doing something. what is the best way for people to connect with you, to learn what you're up to, and most importantly, buy copies of your books?
Yes. My website is just my name, lillydancyger.com, and that's kind of the best place to find all the different things. I have like event listings there, and all my books are available there. My editorial services have a page there. I'm also on Instagram and Blue Sky. I'm off Twitter and Facebook, and Instagram is probably soon to go as well, but for now I'm on Instagram and Blue Sky. Both of them are just at Lilly Dancyger. And Substack is another platform that is full of issues, and I'm probably going to migrate off of there eventually, but for now my newsletter, The Word Cave, is at Substack. I have a couple series there. I write museum pages about looking at visual art and thinking about writing, and What is a Novel, which is a series of musings as I try and teach myself how to write fiction. And that's also where I send out like class listings and like my editorial availability and stuff like that.
Well, all of those things will be in the show notes. And Amelia Ruby, she has a podcast called Off the Grid, which is about getting off social media. She's also an author, and she's a business owner, and she edits podcasts. And she has done this beautiful podcast series on how to get off social media without losing all of your followers, which is really important for, if you're a writer, you need to still be able to connect with your readers. And how do you do this in an age where a lot of these platforms that people have been relying on are changing, or people are finally seeing behind the curtain and saying, what's really going on here, and do I want to engage with that? So yeah, I will be interested to see where you end up.
Someday I'll have my Pynchon era where I'm just not findable anywhere and never seen in public, but not yet. For now, I still need to be findable. So
I happen to share that dream. I think that,
I think a lot of writers do.
I know. And I think there's a life that we can have when we are not doing those things that is vastly different than when we are putting ourselves out there all the time. Thank you so much for being on the podcast today. It has been an absolute pleasure. And thank you again for sharing so much of your wisdom about first love. It was such a gift to be with you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. This was fun.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Lilly, and most importantly, buy a copy of First Love or her other books, please see the show notes for this episode. But before you go, I would love it if you would text the show if you're on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or leave a comment on YouTube with a yes or no response to the following question. Do you believe that memoirs are about more than catharsis? I'd love to know your opinion, and if you have more to say on this, just add it to your response. And speaking of wonderful responses that I've had in the past, I want to give a special thank you to Wendy Kenner, Lisa Rizzo, and Stephanie Schafferin for your kind words about last week's episode with Crystal Prophet. I loved hearing that this episode inspired you, and I just want to thank you so much. And listeners, if you have yet to say hello to me, I look forward to hearing from you too. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. I truly couldn't do this podcast without your support. If you love this episode, here are 3 simple ways you can keep this show thriving. 1, subscribe or follow Writing Your Resilience on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube so you never miss an episode. 2, leave a 5-star review to help others discover the podcast. 3, join my engaged writing community by signing up for the Writing Your Resilience newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Write More, Fret Less, a toolkit for gaslight-proofing your writing practice. Have feedback for the show, a topic you'd love me to cover, or questions you'd like me to answer? Drop a comment on YouTube, text the show, or email me at writingyourresiliencepodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, keep writing, keep growing, and keep showing up for yourself. Your story matters, and I am so proud to be writing alongside you.